All right, so I wanted to make some comments on this thread on the Critical Fallibilism forum. The thread is called Bias, Racism, and Bad Scholarship about Australian Aboriginals. By the way, so this is a forum made by Elliot Temple for intellectual discussion of his philosophy. You can get there by going to discuss.criticalfallibilism.com. So Elliot posted, and he's posting part of an old email. You can see the date here, July 4th, 2012, from the Fabric of Reality list, which was a list for discussing the ideas of David Deutsch and his book, The Fabric of Reality. So, and just as quick context, this guy, Brett Hall, he makes a lot of YouTube videos. He puts himself out there as a sort of explainer of the philosophy and ideas of David Deutsch. And David Deutsch has linked to Mr. Hall on his own webpage. So this is an archive link. But so Hall says, commenting on a story related to Aboriginal people in Australia and allegations of sex abuse. So Hall says half, capitalized, the children had been sexually abused. Half. Sentence fragment there to, you know, lay that in, the emphasis, as somebody said later down on the thread. Would you sedate the abusers if they violently resisted arrest? I would. I wouldn't want to waste my energy on a child abuser by using lots of force. I'd rather just tranquilize, quote, the fucker, unquote, and then that's the end of the quote. And then Elliot comments, here's what Hall's source article actually says. Residents told the Herald they could identify multiple pedophiles still living in the community. Despite a special commission of inquiry, which found 4 years ago about 15% of all the children Tumala and nearby Bogabilla, and I have no idea if I'm pronouncing these names right, so you'll just have to accept best efforts on that, had been reported for sexual harm or risk of sexual harm in 2004-2005. One government worker said up to half the children had been sexually abused. So in this community, they had a commission which investigated the situation in this Aboriginal community, and they found that 15% of all the children had been reported for sexual harm. And then one government worker said up to half the children had been sexually abused. Now, the first thing, and Elliot gets into this, is we have this difference between the 15% figure and up to half. Now, this is reported, and then we have maybe the testimony of a government worker. So maybe the government worker was privy to more information, stuff that didn't get formally reported. You could maybe claim that, but it's not nearly definitive that it's half for certain as Mr. Hall portrayed it. Okay, so that was just a mistake. His source doesn't support that. It's not compatible with it. And using that language imprecisely, support compatible. But so anyway, Elliot said a commission found 15% were either abused or at risk of being abused. Right, right. That's the other. That's the other important qualification. Had been reported for sexual harm or risk of sexual harm. Now, a risk of sexual harm to a child is a serious thing, but it's not the same as having experienced it. And so the 15% number isn't even the set of you know, doesn't even describe the number of children who were reported for actual sexual harm. And then Hall takes the step forward and says, well, it's 50%, which is just absurd. So it says, so maybe 5% were abused, could be less, right? But one unnamed government employee claimed up to half were abused to a reporter, giving no evidence, which doesn't even say half. That means at most half, right? That's like the highest it could possibly be, exactly. And then Paul paraphrased that as half the children had been sexually abused, half, right? So that's just terrible. So Elliot says, I wanted to complain about the atrocious scholarship, but also Paul's whole email defending the brutal treatment of Australian Aboriginals is disturbing. Americans don't defend the treatment of black slaves or Native Americans like that. We may have some biases toward our country, but not like that. I agree. For context, Australia enslaved Aboriginals until the 1970s under the pretext of protecting the children. And the thing I was actually talking about was how psychiatrists decide to fly Aboriginals out of the bush and sedate them, some of them, who don't want to go, and then some of them die from that. Some are being flown out just to be evaluated for maybe having a mental illness, such as being suicidal. Couldn't they do a psych evaluation in the bush? Yeah, exactly. You certainly could. Hall's response was basically to ignore or deny these facts and say it's all just dealing with violent criminal pedophiles who are running rampant in Aboriginal community. He thinks tons of Aboriginals are violent criminals who molest their own children, and he thinks that's just a pure fact and not his egregious racism talk. Right. So then an anonymous poster wrote, the community mentioned, and this is the other post I thought was really interesting in the thread. The community mentioned in the article, Tumala, has a population of 200 to 300 people. Life expectancy for Indigenous Australians in remote communities is low, like around 65. That is really low. If we take a high estimate of the number of children in such a community, 25%, let's say 50 to 70 children, 15% of those children being is like 10% or 10 children total. Right. Yeah, I think the being was just an extra word there. So one bad actor, especially in a community leadership role, can be responsible for all of that. One person out of 200. So I thought that was a good point, which contextualizes the racism a bit more. Because imagining casting aspersions, from such a small set where maybe it's one or a handful of people, imagine casting aspersions on a whole community and rationalizing their brutal treatment. That's kind of nasty. So that was interesting.